right, welcome everyone. Excited to have you here for another MIPIN webinar. Today we're going to be hearing from Ron Rathfin. He is a regional extension forester with Purdue University Extension. He's going to be talking about goat grazing. I love the title of his talk, Ruminations of a Goat Herder on Invasive Species and Forest Stewardship. Before I give Ron a formal introduction, I just want to give you a little bit of background on our organization. There we go. The Midwest Invasive Plant Network, or MIPIN. So our organization was formed in 2006. We're here to coordinate among agencies and organizations across our region, and our mission is to reduce the impacts of invasive plants across the Midwest. And I want to give special recognition to our 2024 sponsors. We have generous sponsorships from the Invasive Species Center in Ontario, Woody Warehouse Nursery, Markham Holman Landscape Architects and Contractors, and Helena Agra. So they are supporting our work this year. If your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor as well, you can find out more at our website. But today's webinar specifically is being sponsored by Woody Warehouse Nursery. They are located in Liston, Indiana. Really happy to have their support. They're a wholesale grower of native plants dedicated to developing dynamic root systems to preserve native hardwood trees. And 95% of their trees are grown from seed that's collected from native tree stands right here in our region. So you can learn more about them at their website listed below. And just one more slide here from MIPIN. If you haven't been to our website lately, it's mipin.org. There's a lot of resources that are there, but I just want to highlight a few. We do maintain a list of invasive plants across our region, and you can see here in the map that our region is 9 states as well as the province of Ontario. So if you go to our plant list, you can find what is all the plants that are either listed and are regulated in each of these states or provinces, and details about how they're regulated if they are. And we've just completed an update of that website, so all the links are current, and we are also working on updating the table that's part of that web page, and that should be done within the next couple of months. We also manage the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative, which you can find at woodyinvasives.org. So if woody invasives are your focus or your interest, you can learn about 28 regulated woody invasives at that website. For management, I'll direct you to our invasive species control database. You can do a customizable search on management techniques for about 50 different invasive plants. And then if you need to find a SISMA or CWMA in your region, so that's a cooperative invasive species management area or weed management area. We have a directory on our website that we keep up to date. There's also resources if you work for a SISMA or CWMA, lists of contractors, native plant suppliers, best management practices, and so forth. So all of that can be found at mipin.org. So thanks for joining us today. If you've been enjoying our webinars, this is we did I think 10 last year. This is our 4th one this year so far. You can find all the recordings on our YouTube channel, and if you'd like to support these outreach efforts that we do, I'm going to put a donation link into the chat in just a little bit, or you can just go to mipin.org. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and invite Ron to share his screen while I do a proper introduction. So we're very happy to have Ron Rathfin with us today. Again, he is an extension forester for Purdue University. He's been there since 1992, stationed at Southern Indiana Purdue Agricultural Center. His research interests include hardwood forest management, regeneration of oak forests, and the management and control of invasive vegetation in forest environments, including the use of prescribed grazing, which is what we're going to hear about today, with goats, and prescribed fire. He provides continuing education programming for forest landowners, professional foresters, and other natural resources professionals. So thank you so much for being here today, Ron, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm excited to, let's see here, I'm trying to get this.
I'll let you know when we
there
see
we
it.
Go. Okay. Yeah, so I'm excited to share my experience with my ruminant friends. In fact, when we were coming up with a title for this presentation, I suggested Ruminations of a Goat Herd, and Michelle decided maybe it should be herder. But I do want to qualify this by saying that I'm not a goat herder. I'm not an animal husbandry person. I am a forester, and so um, I I don't necessarily have the qualifications to talk about, animal health, but the folks here at the Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center, Jason Tower, my colleague who is the farm superintendent, and his farm crew have been instrumental in helping us do this kind of research, and been very supportive. And it's really been enjoyable, using this unique technique to help manage invasive species in the woods.
Ren, we're not seeing your slides yet.
Oh, you're not? Okay. Let's see. What do I need? I see it on my screen. What do I need to do here?
Okay, let me see.
We had it earlier, didn't we?
We did.
Do I need to go to share again?
Yeah, just try it again. That looks like it's sharing now. Okay. There you go.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Okay. So, anyways, now if I can figure out how to advance.
Sometimes it's just a little delayed.
There we go. Okay, so we'll start out with just a little bit of historical background. Foresters worked really hard to get livestock out of the woods over the course of the 20th century. Professor Daniel Denial, who was essentially a forest ecologist at Purdue University back in the mid 20th century, did a lot of studies on the impacts of livestock grazing in the woods. And in fact, it was a very common practice, particularly here in the Midwest, putting livestock in the woods. And you can see one of the publications that he wrote, dated March 1934. And in fact, livestock in the woods was one of the three destructive evils in the forest that the forestry profession was dedicated to eliminating, along with wildfire and uncontrolled logging. And so, we have this history where foresters have, had this negative view of livestock animals in the forest. But kind of like fire, maybe our attitudes have changed. There was, through the 20th century, much of the 20th century, no fire was acceptable in the forest. And of course, Smokey the Bear probably was the single most effective ad campaign in human history. And he was very successful in educating Americans on the evils of forest fires. But towards the end of the 20th century, foresters started to realize that fire was actually a natural part of the environment and could be, under controlled circumstances, be a useful tool in helping us achieve management objectives. And so, maybe there's an opportunity for us to maybe alter our views about livestock in the forest, and think about how livestock animals might be used in a controlled manner to help us achieve management goals. In particular, when it comes to dealing with, other exotic species like invasive vegetation. So I think what we need to do is first define what we mean by prescribed grazing, or sometimes referred to as targeted grazing. And Karen Launchbaugh, who is a range scientist at the University of Idaho, I think came up with an excellent definition for prescribed grazing. She described it, or defined it, as the application of a specific kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish defined vegetation or landscape goals. So good grazing management, where we're trying to do good grazing management, the focus is on the animal and what's best for the animal. When we're talking about prescribed grazing, the focus is on the vegetation outcome, the plant community, what we want to happen there. And prescribed grazing is not a new concept. It's been around for a while, particularly on Western rangelands where it's used to manage invasive plant infestations, but also for fire break management and those more arid environments in the West. There's been more recent applications in the East, for instance, kudzu management in the South, and seen applications for power line rights-of-way management in the Northeast using animals, livestock. So we're seeing more and more of it in the East, but there's really not a lot in the literature, the scientific literature, on the impacts of prescribed grazing with livestock in the forest for invasive vegetation management, and in particular, its impacts on native species. So before I actually describe the first research trial that we did, I just want to give you a little bit of site history. So this research was done at the Southern Indiana Purdue Agricultural Center, which is a over 1,300 acre research farm in Southern Indiana. If anybody is familiar with where French Lick is, it's close to French Lick. But Purdue acquired this property in 1953, and the first study area was on a steep hillside that was mostly an open hillside pasture with some scattered trees. And one of the first things that the property managers did when Purdue acquired it was to plant pine trees to stabilize the soil and reclaim the site and reforest it. And we also have records of 1,000 multiflora rose seedlings being planted along the field edge of this particular tract. Now, I wanted to include a little humorous aside here. Charles Dean was Indiana's first state forester, and he served in that capacity from 1909 to 1928. And he was an interesting, colorful character. Wasn't even a forester by training, but he was actually a druggist. He owned a drugstore, but his real passion was botany, and he is the preeminent botanist of Indiana that cataloged the flora of Indiana through the 20th century, and his Flora of Indiana is still the authority on Indiana plant life. But towards the end of his career in 1948, he made this interesting quote. I understand they are strongly recommending now that all old cemeteries be planted with multiflora rose. When Gabriel sounds his horn, I'm afraid some will be stranded and not be able to get through the roses. Please do not recommend multiflora rose except for the bonfire. And he had some other choice quotes in regards to multiflora rose, which is being extensively planted at the time as a living fence. And I suspect that's why it was planted at this particular location. So anyways, throughout that period of the 1950s, the pine actually mostly failed, and hardwood regeneration prevailed and overtook the pines. But also multiflora rose spread throughout this hillside. And we know that because we have records of an herbicide trial where they were testing various herbicides to control multiflora rose in this particular tract. But from 1962 to 2002, we don't have any records of any kind of control efforts in this particular tract. So by the 2000s, I saw that the timber was starting to become mature, and at some point we would need to harvest mature timber, but with the understory totally overrun with large multiflora rows, we could foresee some regeneration problems in trying to cut any timber. So, the first thing that we attempted to try to manage this population was prescribed fire. And because of the aspect and the moist conditions of this site, we were constrained to do our burning in the fall, after leaf fall, where we had enough of a fuel bed to carry the flames. And we got good dieback on the multiflora rows, but it just grew back with a vengeance. It seemed like the fire just actually invigorated the rows. And after 2 attempts, we realized that fall burning probably wasn't the answer. And so in the meantime, we started running a goat herd at the Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center. And after a few years of the goats being here on this property, I decided that to ask the farm manager if we might be able to use goats in the woods to some degree to help us manage invasives. And so we were able to actually design a prescribed grazing study, and with the immediate objectives of just testing the effects of prescribed grazing using goats on non-native invasive woody species in the woods, and also to determine the impact on the native vegetation that was there. And we wanted to also test timing and intensity of prescribed grazing with some various levels of intensity in terms of stocking levels of goats and numbers of grazings per season. If this proved successful, in the long term, we hope to be able to develop grazing prescriptions to incorporate into an integrated vegetation management system. In describing the stand, basically a mixed mesophytic forest, a lot of mature tulip poplar, but other species mixed in as well. The shrub layer is composed 56% multiflora rose cover, 20% spice bush cover. And where there were little pockets where those 2 shrub species weren't totally shading everything out, there was a rich diversity of mesic herbaceous species. So the treatments that we initially came up with were actually 2 stocking levels, 16 goats per acre and 48 goats per acre. But then within those 2 stocking levels, looking at a single grazing in the spring versus a spring grazing and then a later summer grazing after there was sufficient regrowth. The goats that we used were mature open does and some immature does. We didn't want to put does with kids out in the woods just because we were concerned about attracting predators. We felt that kids would be more attractive to predators. And the breed that we used was actually just a mixed breed that consisted of a mix of Boer, Kiko, Savannah, and Spanish influence. Kind of a mixed breed that's used in meat goat production. And our grazing system was using the portable electrified netting that's very easy to set up, very easy to take down. I will say that when doing research, we don't have the luxury necessarily of finding the path of least resistance to get around and circle the invasive populations. And so in setting up this particular research trial, there was a lot of cutting through the densest parts of the multiflora rows. So there was some blood loss in setting up this research. But basically, the goats were put into their research plots and left there only as long as there was green foliage. Once all the green foliage was stripped, the goats were moved off and moved into the next pasture or next paddock. So the initial results, this is a plot where we had 16 goats per acre. Those goats were initially, that first year, it took them roughly a month to clear out the foliage. And so you can see on the left, May 2nd, 2012, just prior to the goats going into that plot. And then on the right, June 19th, just immediately after they were taken off. And the results are just very dramatic. And it was just really exciting to see what they could do with this wall of green that seemed almost impossible and hopeless to deal with. So we documented, with that initial feeding, 84% reduction in the multiflora rows cover. And so just really, really dramatic. And just another view with the 48 goats per acre stocking level. Basically the same thing, but it just took a lot less time. So 11 to 12 days to get the same result. So, but it's important to understand that as dramatic as that, initial grazing was, it didn't kill the rows. And in fact, we found that the rows is pretty resilient. And in fact, all the invasive brush species are very resilient to grazing. So yes, we weakened them. We reduced their coverage a little bit in that first grazing. But of course, they're just going to grow back. They're going to put out new foliage, put out new shoots. But looking at the actual data year by year over the course of the study, and we grazed for 5 seasons, you can see the incremental reduction. And hopefully everybody can see my pointer here. But in the first year, just to look at these different lines here, the dash and the solid lines are the grazing treatments. The line that's a dash and a dot is the control, where we did nothing. You can see that it was fairly level across the 5 growing seasons. But you can see just a steady incremental reduction year by year that the grazing was causing. And you can see that kind of midway through the study, the ones with the dashed lines, these are the treatments that had 2 grazings per growing season, started to show an increased rate of reduction in the non-native shrub cover. So that by the end, we actually started to see some significant differences between at least one of the 1 grazings per season versus 2 grazings per season. If we look on the right, we can see what's happening to the native shrubs. Goats are generalists, so they're going to eat just about everything with a few notable exceptions. And you can see with the native shrubs, a pretty dramatic decline that first growing season, and then a much slower gradual decline from there on. And I do need to add that after that first growing season, they had opened things up enough to where we could actually fairly easily get in there with a brush saw. And so we went through and we cut all the shrubs that were in excess of 8 feet tall so that we could get them down to a level where the goats could actually reach them. So goats can reach up fairly high. Sometimes they can bend the more flexible stems down by actually stepping on them, to get to the tops. But some of those shrubs that were just, too tall for them to reach, we actually went through and we cut those, and so they could feed on the regrowth. So it's one thing looking at the graphs, but it's another thing to actually look at pictures to see this progressive incremental decline. And so I'm going to run you through a series of photos from a single plot. This was, I think, a low stocking rate plot. And this is just prior to the first grazing in that first growing season, May 2nd, 2012. So this picture now is just before the beginning of the second growing season. And you can actually start to see the forest floor peeking through a little bit. And then after the second growing season, just before the third growing season, now you're really starting to see the ground. So you can see this gradual reduction taking place year by year. If you can hear some hammering in the background, I apologize. We've got some people working in the building with some kind of repair work. And then May 28th, 2015, the end of, after three grazings. And this is after 4 grazings, beginning of the 5th growing season. And you can see just year by year, we're whittling it down to the point where it's much more manageable. And at this stage, now we can very easily come in with pack sprayers and spray what's left, finish off the invasives. What about the native herbaceous plants? Well, yes, of course, they're grazing on the herb species as well. And you can see the dramatic decline in the first year cover, but then it kind of levels off, it achieves a kind of a steady state at a lower level of cover. But what's really interesting to see is species richness and diversity. And you can see for the grazing treatments that we're actually seeing an increase in diversity and richness over the grazing seasons up to about year 4. And then after year 4, with year 5 grazing, just a slight decline taking place. If you look at the dash and dot line down here, this is the control treatment. You can see that species richness and diversity have remained relatively level across the 5-year period. Excuse me, I need to get a drink. And so it's just really interesting that even though the goats are grazing on the herbaceous species, with the opening up of additional growing space by reducing the invasive shrub cover, it's allowing for more species to get established. So the main conclusions that we can draw from that initial trial was, well, number one, multiflora rose is pretty resilient. So we were able to achieve modest incremental annual reductions in cover, approximately a total of 40% total cover reduction in the multiflora rose over the 5-year period. But certainly to a much lower point to where it's much more manageable for using more conventional treatments to finish it off. Multiple grazings per season tended to reduce the woody cover more quickly than just using one grazing per season. And up to 4 years of grazing tended to increase herbaceous vegetation richness and diversity. So we can at least say that the prescribed grazing had a neutral effect on species richness and diversity over that 5-year grazing period. Over a longer period, if we go beyond 5 years, it's hard to say, but I would surmise that we might start to see declines in diversity. Prescribed grazing certainly does open up the understory, facilitating conventional mechanical and herbicide treatments. And so we can reduce herbicide, the amount of herbicide that we have to use. We can reduce the herbicide application labor cost. But I think one of the biggest benefits is the psychological benefit. Even after that initial grazing, that first year, it was a real psychological boost. Just being able to see through and see those individual shrubs and see, instead of this monolith of green, actually being able to see down to the ground and see where those individual shrubs were rooted, and knowing that someday I'm going to be able to get to each one of them and finish them off. So prescribed grazing obviously is not a panacea. It's just another tool to be judiciously applied. And, I think there are certain applications where it's well suited. Steep, rocky ground that may not be conducive or inaccessible to some of the equipment that we might otherwise use in these very dense shrub situations, where we might use a skid steer with a mulching head or some other type of equipment like that. Prescribed grazing would be very good in those applications. And in situations where the invasive brush is just so overrun the area that you don't have much to lose. You're going to lose your native plant component anyways if you don't do anything. And certainly you'd have a lot more non-target damage if you just did broadcast spraying. In 2022, we initiated a second grazing trial where we wanted to test the actual timing of grazing during the growing season, looking at an early spring grazing versus midsummer grazing versus fall grazing, to see how that impacts the target vegetation. And we also incorporated, testing a 1 grazing versus 2 grazings per season treatment within those seasonal treatments as well. In this case, we're using 30 goats per acre. And whereas in the initial trial, we used the open does, this time we decided to use male goats, what's called a wether. If you're not familiar with that, it's a castrated male. And these are male goats from our own herd here. Normally, these animals would be sold at auction after they're weaned, but we kept back 30 of these wethers to be used as our forestry goats. And just some of the initial results that we're seeing, we're in our 3rd year of grazing now. Spring grazing really much more rapidly reduces the invasive brush than either the summer, but in particular the fall. And of course, when you couple that with 2 grazings per season, it's really reducing the brush very quickly. After a 3rd grazing, which we just did last month, that invasive brush has just really been whittled back. We also have found that the fall grazing has not been productive at all. It seems that by late September, early October, the goats are done. They're just not interested. And I don't know if it's because there's a chemical change in the foliage. Maybe the nutrients are being mobilized and moved out of the leaves to translocate down to the roots for the dormant season, or what it might be, but they're just not feeding at that time of year. Okay, and so I just thought I'd show you a few videos here of our current grazing study, and so you can, get a better sense if you've never watched goats in the woods to see how they operate. Okay, so here's the goats actually in action on some multiflora rows and some burning bush. I hope everybody can hear them munching. And
The video is coming through. I'm not hearing the audio, but
okay, I can hear it in mine, but oh well. But if you're observing here, what they really focus on are those more tender tips. They're not eating the real tough, woody stems, but the more tender shoot tips and all the foliage. I mean, even a large dense multiflora rose shrub, they will work their way into the middle of that shrub to try to glean every little leaf out of it that they can. And little by little, they'll, any of that new growth will get eaten off. And particularly with the multiflora rose, older canes, tend to die back, and they depend on putting out new canes from the crown. And so over time, this really helps the goats to really whittle them back to a smaller size. Okay, and sometimes I have fun, and in this particular lot, this is not one of the research plots, but we're actually operationally grazing close to 50 acres of invaded forest, and so this is one of the operational plots. And I'm bending over this large bush honeysuckle that they can't reach the top of, but as I bend it over, you can just watch them crowd in and just join in a feeding frenzy. It's fun to watch. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Skip ahead a little bit more. They're getting to the last part up in the top there, trying to reach it, standing on top of each other to reach it, standing on their hind legs. And just the last few little remnants of leaves being finished off. Okay. And browsing or grazing is not the only way that they affect the invasives. They can also do some damage to the invasives with their horns. They like to rub their horns on something that's firm and rough. And this is a bush honeysuckle that's just been thrashed. This must be an irresistible sensation that they have up in their crown there. And here in this case, this is a multiflora rose that has grown up into one of these understory trees where they can't reach the foliage, but perhaps by rubbing their horns enough, they might girdle those stems and cause them to die back. You can see how high up the rose can grow. Okay. Okay, so that's our second grazing study and our operational grazing that we're doing. We just opened up several, probably another close to 10 acres that haven't been grazed yet, that will be grazing this year. And finding it a very efficient way to to get heavily infested areas cleared out to the point where it's much more manageable with our more conventional treatments. So, how are we doing on time? Just
No, we've got a few more minutes.
okay. Kind of to wrap things up, you know, there's a number of models that could be used to to use goats for invasive management. Perhaps landowners that already own and raise goats, they've already got the experience, they know how to do it, they've already got all the equipment they need, and so if they've got the infestations, it's a natural for them. But for most landowners, that's not the case. So other options would be start your own goat herd by purchasing goats for permanent use, or at least until the job's done. Or number three, you can start your own herd with the intent of selling them at the end of each growing season, and then purchasing new goats in the spring. That way you can kind of recoup some of your costs each year and not have to take care of the goats and feed them through the dormant season. Number four, maybe a neighbor or a friend raises goats, and so you can say, hey, I've got some alternative grazing area for you on my property. Number five, hiring a herd for hire. And it's, I guess, a growing industry, perhaps more common on the West Coast, maybe even more, maybe more so on the East Coast than here in the Midwest. But we're seeing more and more folks going into it, and hopefully we'll continue to see the number of herd for hire operations grow. Did want to just mention a little bit on costs of grazing. Here's just give you an idea of the cost of that netting and a charger. So 164-foot rolls of netting. It costs $135 per roll. If you wanted to fence 1 acre, that'd be $675 of initial outlay. If you're fencing 5 acres, that'd be over $1,600. Of course, a charger, you want to have a charger that's sized to the length of fencing that you're going to be setting up. And most likely you'll be using a deep cycle battery, so there's your battery cost and so forth. What it comes down to per acre over a 5-year lifespan of the fence is over $306 per year per acre to fence 1 acre. Or if you're fencing 5 acres, over $103 per acre. Very quickly, a comparison of labor and herbicide costs for the actual follow-up control after that first grazing trial. Conventional control costs alone were about 27 hours per acre of labor, over 47 gallons of herbicide applied, versus the much reduced rates that you see here for our different grazing treatments. And if we put the dollar figure on it, assuming $20 per hour for labor, and you can see the herbicide costs down here. Just to quickly sum it up, our conventional control treatments are roughly over $600 an acre. And, that's a minimal cost for heavy brush control treatments using conventional treatments. And you can see the much lower control costs after we've done the prescribed grazing. And herd for hire costs, I've seen anywhere from $600 to $1,300 per acre to rent a goat herd just for one grazing treatment. So kind of pricey, but maybe an option for folks that really want to reduce the amount of chemical that they want to apply. Okay. I don't know if we have time for a few questions, but certainly prescribed grazing may be an option in certain situations.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I love seeing the videos. I think everyone probably enjoyed that. And we had a question about whether you could apply this to honeysuckle and buckthorn, and I think you answered that question with your videos.
Yeah. So bush honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle, yes, they'll readily feed on any of those. I'm sure buckthorn too.
There was a question if they could be used for herbaceous material, stiltgrass specifically was asked.
Yeah, I've been asked that question a number of times before. Goats are more browsers. So when given the choice, they're going to go after, woody things first to browse on. Not that they don't eat grass, but I think stiltgrass might be the last thing that they would try to graze on.
Okay.
And of course, deer don't feed on stiltgrass at all. So I'm not sure goats would. Sheep might be an option if you've got a stiltgrass problem like that.
Another question we had was about, the labor involved and like overseeing the herd while they're grazing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we our supervision is basically just checking on them once a day. We do put out pans of water, small pans, and generally they're not drinking much water. They're getting most of their water from the vegetation. But we can tell when they're really ready to move when they start drinking water. When you see that water level go down in their pans. Mm. Some people have asked about, having guard dogs. We have not employed dogs. We have not had any problems with predation, and they've been grazing in some fairly remote locations in the deep forest. So there are coyotes around, there's fox around, but so far we have not had any problems. And of course, one of the deterrents is the electrified netting. And plus, we're not putting young goats out there, kids. And so these goats are probably a little bit better able to, maybe discourage a would-be predator. I'm not saying it wouldn't be a problem in some locations, and where you might not need to take special measures to, defend them against predation. But so far, we have not had any problems with it.
Okay. think we'll just have time for a couple more questions. One was if you know of any resources, there are a couple different questions about resources. One is there a group that you're aware of that supports people who want to develop a herd? And then where would you direct people if they wanted, for municipalities that might want to take advantage of goat grazing as a invasive species management tool?
Yeah. So, I haven't really identified a good support organization. Um, Basically, the goat, the goat organizations that we have here in Indiana are pretty much kind of devoted to show goats, raising goats for the fair. Um, and So I haven't really seen anything yet. Maybe somebody else is aware of some kind of organization other than uh, the herd for hire. Uh, there is a kind of a franchise, that where people that want to get into the business can actually become a franchisee under this umbrella organization, and they can help you do the marketing and so forth.
And then if there was a like a municipality or other type of organization that wanted to pursue this, I know MIPIN's been working on a list of goat grazing providers. So you're welcome to contact me if you just need a name of someone.
Hmm.
Um, but if you need logistical information, Ron's going to be the one you want to go to.
Yeah, I can share the experience that I have. Um, And I know sometimes people ask, can we get you to bring your goats to our property? And unfortunately, uh, our goats are pretty well fully employed here at the Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center. But even if we did have a week or two in their busy schedule, we're not allowed to take our animals to other people's property.
Okay, that's good to know. We did get a comment in the chat that the International Goat Research Center might be a good resource for
Hmm,
people who want to learn more.
okay,
Okay.
I'll have to check that one out myself.
We have a couple other questions, but I think we need to wrap up to try and stay on time today. But Ron, you see you've got your email here.
Hmm.
And then if anyone has any question, I can help direct you to anything. I'm also happy to do that. So I'll put my email in the chat as well. And I think we're gonna end there. We we did record this webinar, so once we get the closed captioning finalized, it'll go up on MIPIN's YouTube channel, so you'll be able to revisit it or share it as you need to. So thanks again, Ron. Really appreciate your time today. It's a great
Oh,
presentation.
yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Michelle.
All right. Thanks everyone for being here today.